day, I did 2 flights on that day in the P40s, 3082, 3194. Since then I've written the models. They were M's, N's and K's, and each one was slightly different, but we were never told that when we flew, it was just the registration or the numbers of the aircraft on the blackboard, and we didn't have a clue what model it was. And they did vary slightly. Anyway, that was the only drama on that day. I did a few circuits then in 3194, and the next day on the 4th, we had just come from a month at Levin, and at Levin, NCO's course, every morning at 9 o'clock we'd be out doing our military drill, and our predecessors who had been at Levin, at Harkia, and they would come across and dive and make a hell of a screeching noise over the parade ground. So I decided to do the same on the next day. And it's hard to believe now, but by the time I reached on this second day, first flight, by the time I reached Levin I was 13,000 feet, and so it was directly under me, and I had, and a few of us, way back in 1941, my cousin who went to Singapore was killed flying a Buffalo. He was shot down only 2 weeks after the happened war started. But anyway, he came up to Cambridge and visited us because he'd never been to North Island. He came from Christchurch and he'd been flying these Harvards. This is 1941, they were brand new. And he told me that they dived into 300. The VNE is about 226 I see on Google. Anyway, so I had dived a Harvard to 300, so that didn't seem very fast for a P40 of course. So I didn't just dive like that, I got directly over, pulled the nose up, rolled inverted, straight and then did an absolutely vertical dive. And by the time I expect, directly over the Levin parade ground, just on time like our predecessors. But I didn't dive in a flattish dive, I went right over the top, pulled the nose up, rolled inverted and held it vertically. Now it doesn't take long for a P40. As Doug mentioned, even in spit you lower the nose you're doing 300 knots. And I hadn't gone long when I did glance at the ASI and it was reading 460. I couldn't believe it, but anyway, that was true. I still remember 460, God. And then the ground was starting to get big very quick. So I hauled back on the stick and completely, oh no, that was the next day. No, I still did it. I did start to rapidly recover from a vertical dive, and by the time I got from there to there, it started to roll at that stage to the right, and I had to let the throttle go and put 2 hands on the stick. And yeah, and I had 2 hands on the stick with the plane banked like that. And it's a thing I'll never forget because it was one of those times. And now, I've had a number of people query this and because I've mentioned it in my books and they don't believe it. However, I got to where it banked 90 degrees and I was going round like so, and I had all my force was 2 hands on the control column to stop it rolling further, and I had to wait till it slowed down enough before I could get back to wings level. Now, for those who don't believe that, I've got some evidence here of it happening before. This is an excerpt from the book Flying Tigers, or Bar Black Sheep, I think it was called, by Pappy Boynton. He was the CEO flying the P-40s. in China. And it says here that they said it appeared as though Sandy had spun his aeroplane deliberately at high altitude and then appeared to be having difficulty in recovering. But eventually the plane recovered completely and he was in a steep dive. At fairly low level, Sandy apparently hauled back on the stick too rapidly when pulling out of the dive, and his P-40 half-rolled slowly, going into the ground in an inverted attitude. So that was still doing exactly what happened to me, or at least almost. Because people query my experience, I've sort of researched a bit, and this is the US Air Force training about diving P-40s. It's a great diving airplane. It dives at maximum allowable speeds. It has shown no tendency to vibrate, flutter, or break to pieces. This is it. This doesn't mean that high-speed dives are recommended, particularly at low altitudes. Remember, you need 5,000 to 8,000 feet to recover from a high-speed dive. The P-40 is redlined at 480 IAS, but while you are in training, you should not dive at a speed exceeding 350. It says when diving, the P-40 tends to roll to the right. The higher the speed of the dive, the greater the tendency to roll. Compensate by using left rudder pressure and left rudder trim, tab control. Well, I couldn't take my hand off the stick anyway, so I stuck with, but I didn't know anything about that anyway. I'd said all the P-40s except M and N models have short tails, and that means greater rudder and elevator loads. Now, I actually have run, what's his name, I've got it written here, Garth Hogan. He's the man who rebuilds these things. And he's also, Garth has flown them a lot as well. And he noticed that it got highly out of balance in a steep dive, but he probably wasn't diving vertically anyway. But he noticed it got very out of balance, the ball going out to the left, so he had to re-trim a lot. And that's what I wasn't aware of at the time myself. So, now, and Garth Hogan also told me something about the next flight where I had just about as dangerous a situation. Where are we? Now, the next, so that's the first, that was the first episode. The next episode was on the next flight when I did the same dive onto the parade ground the next day. Now, on that flight, I did not know, because it only had a rudder trim, I didn't know that there was a switch somewhere on the plane that said left wing up and left wing down, or words to that effect. But anyway, I was told about that, and on the next time I did the same dive, I discovered that switch and I used that and it didn't roll. But on that flight, I had another interesting situation where I was in the vertical dive again, and the ground started to come up quick, so I hauled back so fast that I completely blacked out. And when I came to, I was pointing that way, luckily. And I immediately noticed that, it's on here, that's why I brought this photo here. I immediately noticed that the coolant temperature gauge was showing 0 on the coolant temperature. And so I thought to myself, well, how do you heat an engine up? Well, you bring the mixture back into lean, give it plenty of power, climb steeply at a slow airspeed, and all I could think of was close the radiators. I had radiators like cowgirls. Close the radiators, and before I knew it, I was back to about 13,000 feet again, and still everything was showing, or the gate, my cylinder head temp was still, not cylinder head, the coolant temp was showing 0 still. So I headed back towards the Harkia, and I didn't know what the problem was, except that when I went to use radio, I couldn't use it, so then I knew I had an electrical problem of some sort. However, I didn't know what it was, so I thought I'd better go and land, and I was diving about 13,000 feet. I sort of went over a Harkia at a couple of thousand feet, pull the nose up and go several thousand feet, and I was seesawing back and forth trying to slow the thing down. Anyway, then I was looking around the cockpit trying to find what on earth was causing an electrical problem. Now, we hadn't been shown it that night when we were shown the P40 because these were circuit breakers, and they were circuit breaker switches, and they are shown here, just in front of my thumb there, there's 5 switches. Now, this is a restored Kitty Hawk, and it's nice clean perspex. Our aircraft had been flying in the Pacific mostly. In fact, I flew this one here 4 times in my training, 3072, it's in my logbook. And also another plane that Jeff Fiskin shot down 2 zeros in this one behind me, and he shot down 2 zeros and a Betty bomber in one flight in this 3060. Now here's my logbook sitting there somewhere, and I flew it 4 times as well, this one. So I've actually flown both of these 2 aircraft of his in training at the Harkia. Now, this is something that people have doubted me again, and this is experienced pilots may doubt my story as I've written about. When I hauled this out so hard that I blacked out completely, woke up and the coolant was reading 0, then when searching around the cockpit after heading back towards the Harkia, I started switching, and when I lifted this cover, now because this plane had been in the tropics, you couldn't see through that plastic, it was all crazed. And I lifted that thing up, and all the switches were in the down position. Now, it says on here, you could read it with a magnifying glass, that these 2 right-hand switches should be always in the upper position. In other words, they're just circuit breakers. That's why we weren't told about them, because it wasn't something you did on your take-off checks. So, I switched all those switches up, and everything worked again. The radio came on and whatever. Okay, now why I brought Doug Brooker, what's it, here we are. Oh, Garth Hogan into it. I asked critics of what I said, that I could throw those switches off, said no, you could never throw a switch off pulling out of a dive. However, I did prove that you can, and so I rang Garth Hogan asking how long were those switches, and he said they're a good inch of length. So these switches were long enough that there was enough centripetal force, that they could be centrifugally thrown off. But you'd wonder why in the hell would Curtiss build an aircraft where if you pull it really tight, you turn the switches off. And yet, I've never read of or heard of anyone else who ever did it, so apparently I'm the only one. But anyway, I proved conclusively, see, I couldn't have flown in the first place if I hadn't used the radio to taxi out. The other thing is, I immediately noticed my coolant temperature was 0, which proves that I've been monitoring it anyway. But there's still no one believes that I ever did it. So that's about the 3 first flights off the circuit, where you could say were fairly dangerous ones.
What G-forces theory would it take to...
We didn't have accelerometers in them that I can remember, no. Mind you, if you're flying a P40, you can black out any time if you haul a stick back.
You ready for your film now, Bryan?
Just about. Okay, I'll just quickly show them a couple of photos. Oh, I'll leave these photos here that you can come and see later in time. As I say, our aircraft had all been flown in combat. That's just, this chap was my flight commander in 16 Squadron, Butch Avery from Hamilton. He was a very old bloke, he was 30. So I was only 19 when I was flying these. And look at the tail of this P-40. Anyway, so that's just my introduction to P-40s.